behalf of one of our table sponsors here in the back of the room, the Minnesotans for Ron Paul. Thank you for your participation tonight as well. And with that, I will get off the stage and welcome back Senator Tom.
All right, we're going to change up the order just a little bit because we feel it might be a little bit more continuity of topic. I'm glad to have all of you back here, and let's move the program along so you can all get home and get a good night's rest and go out here tomorrow and apply what we learned. Chris Andriski, I've known for quite some time. He has, we've sat and tipped a few cups of coffee and talked about economics. It's always very interesting and enlightening. I want to give him credit for having served in the Army and defended our country from 1991 to 1994. He is a licensed CPA in the state of Minnesota and holds a degree in accounting as well as a master's degree in business with an emphasis in information technology. It is nice to have an accountant here along with the economist, although I would point out that typically accountants are people who do not have the personality to become an economist. So, with no further ado, Chris, good to see you.
Did you guys get that? Did you switch the slide? My PowerPoint?
Yep. Good.
All right, so you're already there. Perfect. Why don't you go to the next one that just shows the national debt? I'm going to talk about the national debt a little bit, some of our challenges as a country, and then I'm going to talk about tax policy because at the end of the day, there are some entitlements that need to be paid for, and we do have to collect some revenue from citizens, unfortunately, to cover that. If you look at the first slide, are we on the first slide? Perfect. We'll start with just the national debt as of June 30th, a little over $14 trillion. Look at the interest expense we paid on that national debt in 2010. And in 2011, we're going to be a little over 10% of GDP, running a deficit as a nation. And when you think of your household, if you ran a deficit of 10% of your income, annually you'd run out of money real quick and be filing for bankruptcy. Go to the next slide, please. We're going to start with Jimmy Carter because I was born in 1973 and I thought this was a good 30, 40-year clip of where the national debt was and over each presidency where we went during that presidency. The national debt in 1976 was $653 billion. The key number here, I think, is to look at the percentage of GDP that we had as a national debt. From Carter to Reagan increased the national debt quite a bit. And we went to 52% of GDP. H.W. Bush went to 55%. Go to the next slide, please. Clinton actually decreased the national debt as a percentage of GDP slightly, although he did increase the national debt. And then George W. and, of course, Obama has increased it significantly. So go to what slide are we on here now? Go to the slide that says deficit, debt, and things to consider. Perfect. So one of the things that when you look at the national debt and the history of what's taken place in the last 40 years, in 1995, we had a national debt that was about a third of what we have now, yet our interest expense now is barely higher than it was back then. My point in all this is, if interest rates go up just 1%, that's going to be significant in the long-term solvency as a nation as we try to address our interest expense, and given that we've got a national debt that's almost 3 times as it was in 1995, this is going to pose a big problem. It's going to be a challenge that we're going to have to address. Bill's going to talk next, but the Federal Reserve has been keeping interest rates low against the low of the market, which has essentially helped the government finance some of this deficit spending, and it's going to come to an end very quickly. And Bill's going to talk to that here in just a bit, but that's something that's lost in all this. Bill Clinton had a national debt of about $5 trillion. We almost have $15 trillion right now, but our interest expense isn't nearly triple of what it was in 1995. And at some point, that's going to come due. Next slide, please. When we look at revenue that we're collecting right now as a nation, the payroll tax is a significant part of what we collect as a government. Now, the payroll tax used to be off the operating budget. Lyndon Johnson was the first president to put Social Security taxes and Medicare taxes, your FICA, that's collected in your paycheck. Lyndon Johnson was the first one to put that on the operating budget. So now when presidents and Congress talk about deficits and talk about surpluses, they include that revenue in that number. But the reality is that money is supposed to be held aside to pay Social Security, to pay for Medicare expenses. And Lyndon Johnson was the first one to include that in the operating budget. And so these deficits that we're talking about here are actually fabricated. in the favor of the politician, because if you take that money off the operating budget like it's supposed to be, we really have larger deficits than we are even projecting. And Bill Clinton actually showed a surplus in 2000. But that surplus was largely because of the fact that Bill Clinton, he really benefited from the fact that you had baby boomers who were in their their highest earning years. He benefited from the 1983 Social Security Act, which was signed into law by Ronald Reagan, which significantly increased the amount of your salary that you pay into Social Security and the percentage that you pay into Social Security. And in the 1990s, that was the first decade that that was fully implemented. And so Bill Clinton, although he had a surplus, it wasn't a real surplus because it included Social Security receipts through the payroll tax. And in a twist of irony, and I don't know if King and Kurt and some of the other panelists would agree with me, but in 2000, a lot of people would credit Bill Clinton for the election of W. Bush, because when Bush went around and campaigned, he talked about the surplus, how it was your money, how we need to refund it to you, and the reality was there wasn't an operating surplus. Bill Clinton drove an operating deficit, but he had the benefit of a baby boomer generation that had fat wages, and they were in their peak wage earning periods, plus that he had a robust economy through technological advances. And so, although there was a surplus, it wasn't a real surplus because of the payroll taxes that were collected that were on the operating budget. If we can go to the next slide, please. Medicare. Medicare is a big problem that's going to be coming due here very shortly. And in 1993, Bill Clinton, before 1993, you were capped at what you paid into Medicare. And so, at $130,000, after you made over $130,000, you stopped paying into Medicare. One of the things that Bill Clinton did in 1993 is he uncapped that, so people had to fund Medicare with all their wage base. And imagine where we'd be if he hadn't have done that. Right now, Medicare assumes 23% of the national budget. And between 2010 and 2030, we're going to double the number of people dependent on Medicare. So this is a huge problem. The funds are going to be insufficient in 2019, so they're going to have to address this very soon. Next slide, please. The Social Security Trust Fund. I don't think Social Security personally is as big of a problem as Medicare, and I'd love to get the panelists' opinions on that. The trust fund is going to run out in 2037. Certainly it's a Ponzi scheme. It's actually worse than a Ponzi scheme. With a Ponzi scheme, you quantify the money, you know it's there, you know it has to be paid. Payroll taxes, unfortunately, has become nothing more than another mechanism to collect taxes because they've been playing around with it with credits and whatnot, and it's really shameful, actually, what they've done. In the 1980s, roughly 90% of your salary, of the salaries collected in the United States, went to payroll taxes. So in other words, payroll taxes, you pay them to a certain wage base, and then when you're over that wage base, it doesn't get collected anymore. In the 1980s, about 90% of the wage base was paying payroll taxes. Now we're in the high 80s, and if we want to get Social Security solvent, we need to get back to 90%, which would mean by 2020 raising the salary that we collect Social Security taxes on to $190,000 a year. And if we do some incremental annual increase changes to Social Security benefits, and we increase the wage base, I think Social Security is actually a very manageable problem for the government. Medicare is the real problem. Next slide, please. So the distribution, the federal budget and its distribution. So we already talked about Medicare being about 23% of the budget. Defense and security is about 23% of the budget. Social Security is 22% of the budget. The interest on the debt is 7%, and then we've got some other items. So those four items take up about 75% of the budget. Next slide, please. In August, obviously, we had the debt ceiling debate, and it was next to impossible to not raise the debt ceiling, not raise taxes, and not cut out of those four items right there. Now, in the short term, you could have, because the different agencies had some cash reserves, but ultimately, these are long-term problems that need to be addressed, and it was really a tragedy to see some of that discussion take place in a non-quantitative way, because I really think that it was a great opportunity for us to have a big package as a country and come to some 10-year solvency solution, and they really didn't do that because they increased the debt ceiling without significant costs, without a revenue restructuring, without addressing our progressive taxation that excludes a lot of people from paying taxes and gives corporations reasons not do business in the United States. So I think what happened in August was unfortunate. Next slide, please. You know, I threw this slide in there because really employment is the key. As we get people back to work, people are paying taxes, etc. Next slide, please. The federal government, sources of revenue from the federal government. So 45% is from individual income taxes. Remember, half don't pay taxes, income taxes almost, but 45% of the revenue that the government collects is from individual income taxes. So that means that you've got a very small base of Americans paying income taxes, and they're paying at high rates to cover about half of what the government collects. About 35% is from payroll taxes, 10% is from corporate revenue, and then 10% from other various sources. Next slide, please. So tax reform. Tax reform is a big part of what's going to, I think, take care of our solvency as a nation if we get there, and it's going to involve broadening the tax base. We don't have a supply side tax-based policy right now as a country. We've got a very small percentage of the population paying taxes, and they're paying at a large percentage. We need to change how we tax corporations, in my opinion, and we need to make the tax code less preferential, because right now you have lobbyists understanding, especially in the last 10 years, they can use the tax code as a mechanism for getting what they want, and then the public doesn't pay attention because it's very technical and very detailed. And it's dangerous because essentially lobbyists are getting what they want without accountability. Next slide, please. One of the reasons we have such a preferential tax code, one of the reasons we have such a progressive tax code is because of tax credits. Nothing is more progressive than a tax credit. When you give someone a tax credit, it's a dollar for dollar credit. And so by giving them a tax credit, if they're in the 15% bracket, they're essentially omitting about $14,000 of their income. And what we've done in the last 10 years is we've really increased significantly the number of tax credits that are available in the tax code, and I think it's a dangerous policy, and we need to revert back to more balanced, flatter tax policy that's more understandable, it's less preferential. Next slide, please. I cannot see the slide. Sorry, I don't know what to share. Just come off. So I'm see what's going on here. Thank you. All right, can everybody hear me? Thank you. Now I can see what slide I'm on. Sorry. So I talked about the tax credits being progressive. So when we have a tax code where people are getting credits instead of deductions, if you're in the lower brackets, that's a significant omission of tax liability. And it's really what's driven this 50% of the population not paying taxes. We need to get rid of these preferential tax treatments that have largely come in the last 10 years. And if you add mortgage interest deductions, you add property taxes, you add exemptions, and you add other types of tax credits, you can see how real quickly the tax liability can be eliminated. And historically, even when we had a lot less tax credits, most of them were non-refundable tax credits. So you only got a credit to the extent that you had tax liability. And that's changed a lot in the last 10 years too. Next slide, please. Now we have refundable tax credits. And what refundable tax credits are is they're essentially welfare disguised in the tax code. And thank you. What this does is gives you a tax credit to the extent that you have liability, and then it gives you additional money above and beyond any liability you might have had. Now, Ronald Reagan started this type of tax policy with the earned income credit. And the earned income credit was supposed to be an incentive for people to work and to give them a little extra money if they were working, you know, with a certain number of dependents, etc. So the earned income credit really opened the gate to this type of policy. But Bush and Obama have really expedited this kind of policy, and now we've got all kinds of tax credits that not only offset your income liability, income tax liability, but they offset your FICA taxes that you're paid. In a lot of cases, they give you money back above and beyond the liability that you had initially. And so this is dangerous policy because essentially what you're doing is you're omitting people from paying taxes, and it gets to that breaking point where the